Welcome everyone, and I hope you're all safe and well in this difficult time. Thank you for joining us today for our flagship event of the year. My name is Shobhan Deer. I'm the Vice President of Oxford Climate Society, and I'm a PhD student at Oxford working to develop sustainable batteries to support renewables. For those joining us for the first time, Oxford Climate Society is a part of Oxford University, aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we run educational programs throughout the year, including our award-winning School of Climate Change, which is currently teaching over 1,400 people from all over the world in this term's school, and it's open to all. In addition to this, we run the world's largest student-run climate journal, Anthroposphere. We're also running a Decarbonize Oxford campaign, and we're currently working with the university to develop net zero policies and incorporate climate onto the Oxford curriculum. So the theme of today's event is neoliberalism, democracy, and the climate crisis. Neoliberalism has been the dominant political and economic ideology around the world for the past 40 years. Key neoliberal policy measures include deregulation, privatization, reduction of welfare programs, and tax cuts for the wealthy. The prioritization of private profit has resulted in economic growth for the wealthy. However, it has led to a dramatic increase in inequality and considerable environmental damage, driven by relentless overconsumption and deregulation. Meanwhile, governments all over the world have repeatedly failed to take action and reduce emissions in line with those targets advised by the world-leading climate scientists. Climate change requires significant early action, but the neoliberal focus on quarterly profits and the focus of our democracies on quick wins for short election cycles has created a pervasive culture of short-termism in our societies. Neoliberalism has also minimized the role of the state in favor of pro-market policies, but there is considerable evidence that significant government intervention is required if we are to decarbonize in time. Therefore, are our current political and economic institutions even compatible with climate change and taking enough climate action? If not, what must change in our democracies and the dominant neoliberal model to make it so? And given we must reach globally net zero emissions in under 30 years to mitigate the most severe impacts of climate change, what must we as citizens do to ensure this happens? To provide insight into these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by world-leading public intellectual Noam Chomsky. Known as the father of modern linguistics, Noam Chomsky is also a philosopher, cognitive scientist, historian, social critic, and political activist. He's one of the most cited scholars in modern history and also one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world, having written more than 150 books on topics such as war, politics, linguistics, mass media, and recently a fantastic book on the climate. Chomsky is also a major figure in analytic philosophy and one of the founders of the fields of cognitive science. He is Laureate Professor of Linguistics at University of Arizona and Institute Professor Emeritus at MIT. So we're going to start this event with Professor Chomsky giving a short speech with his thoughts on the topic, followed by some questions from myself, before opening it to questions from you, the audience, at the end. So if you have any questions for Professor Chomsky, please write them in the live stream chat on the right-hand side. So thank you so much, Professor Chomsky, for joining us today. It is honestly the greatest possible honor to welcome you to this event. So I'll hand it over to you to start. Thank you. You're muted, sorry, Professor. You're muted. Oh, wait, one sec. Yeah, you're perfect.
Okay, good. Always glad to be back at Oxford, which I've enjoyed very much over the years. Well, I'll just say a couple of words about the general topic and then we can move on to discussion. I'll start with a comment by an Oxford professor of physics, Raymond Pierre Humbert, one of the leading figures in the IPCC 2018 statement, the last major IPCC statement, since been updated with even more urgent demands. He's writing in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and the major scientific journal concerned with such issues. He opens by saying, let's get this on the table right away without mincing words. With regard to the climate crisis, yes, it's time to panic. We are in deep trouble. There is no plan B. We must move to zero net carbon emissions and fast, meeting the goal the IPC recommends by mid-century, which means starting right away. Doesn't mean starting in 20 years. Well, you know the details. I'm not going to run through them. There are, for example, recent major reports, proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, dozens of scholars involved, predicting what they call a hothouse Earth, Earth temperature stabilizing at 45 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is about 2 or 3 times the level possible for human survival, more than stragglers here and there, essentially the end of organized human society. That's the course we're on. We know what to do. There are solutions. They're feasible. They're within grasp, but they have to be undertaken. And there's plenty of resistance. Fossil fuel companies, much worse in the United States than in Europe, but very strong. There are media. So for example, after Joe Biden rejoined the Paris agreements, the Wall Street Journal lamented that this will let China get ahead of us in producing fossil fuels, and we have to be the first to fall off the precipice. That's American exceptionalism, without a comment. Another opponent to progress is the entire Republican Party, for very interesting reasons, worth looking at to see how politics works, particularly in the neoliberal age. In 2008, the candidate for the Republican Party was McCain, not my favorite person, but somewhat of an old-fashioned pre-neoliberal, neoliberal Republican. He had a moderate, very limited, but existing climate policy. Republican Party in that day also was considering climate problems, barely. The Koch brothers, the huge energy conglomerate, Texas-based, which has been struggling for years to keep the Republican Party from recognizing climate change, that climate change is even happening. They were infuriated. They launched a huge juggernaut, bribed senators, threatened them with primary challengers, organized a huge lobbying campaign, AstroTurf campaigns, fake popular organizations. Didn't take long for them to buy off the whole party. They all became adamant climate deniers, not just Trump. You take a look at the last Republican primary, the 2016, there was none this year. 2016, every participant, this is the cream of the Republican Party, either denied that global warming is happening or agreed maybe it's happening, but it's not our business. There was one candidate who was praised by the liberal media as the adult in the room. He was so praised, he was even invited to speak at the 2020 Democratic Party convention. John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, he said, yes, he was the one to say, yes, global warming is taking place. He's governor of Ohio. But we in Ohio are going to use our coal and we're not going to apologize for it. So he's the one who's praised. Actually, he's the worst of all of them by any measure. The others could at least pretend, of course, lying that they didn't know about it. He said, yeah, we know about it. We're racing to the precipice. We're going to fall off and we're going to do it. So he's the adult in the room. That's the Republican Party. It's almost half the population. By now, incidentally, in Trump's pocket, they're going to be with us for a long time to come. Well, those are problems. Trump just was a kind of a caricature of the neoliberal programs of the past 40 years. He didn't create them, he just extended them to absurdity. The program basically calls for a business model to run everything. Market, transfer things to markets, deregulate, no spare capacity. You're running an automobile factory, you want everything to be just on time delivery, no excess. If the assembly line stops for a couple of minutes, well, not a huge problem, but you don't want to waste money preparing for that. Well, as soon as you move to human affairs, you're asking for suicide. That's what's just happened dramatically in Texas. It's on the headlines right now. That's neoliberalism brought to a caricature. Over 25 years of deregulation, elimination of any central authority, competing units on the market. It's supposed to be wonderful. Slightly reduces costs, maybe, though people have no idea what they're asking for. You can't read all the small print in the credit. They're basically buying. What a market means is you buy what's advertised on Google. We all know this. You want to buy something, you look up Google, it gives you top picks. Very few people are going to go down to the 40th thing, which may be the best. Top pick is the one that got the most ads. So the one that gives you the most ads, that's the top pick. And unless you're fanatically interested, that's the one you pick. That's called consumer choice. So in Texas, you had consumer choice for power, no regulation, almost no regulation, delinked from the national energy grid. You have an ice storm, total collapse. The system literally came within minutes of completely crashing, total. As it is, people are dying, they're getting bills of $10,000 a month, it's all crazy. Well, that's same with hospitals. Why do we not have hospital beds? Because hospitals are run on a neoliberal model. You're not supposed to have spare capacity. What's the point of wasting beds that you're only going to use very irregularly when you need them? Actually, England is showing the way forward on this. Tory government has, including New Labour, incidentally, mild Tories, has been bent on turning the best healthcare system in the world, the former NHS, into the worst system in the world, the US system. Twice the costs of other OECD countries, some of the worst outcomes. Lancet had a study of it recently, estimated that the privatized, grossly inefficient, bureaucratized American system costs about an extra $500 billion a year, about 70,000 extra deaths. So that's what England is racing towards. Got to get rid of that efficient National Health Service. Well, all this goes back to, actually started in the late 70s, took off with Reagan and Thatcher. They wanted to make, what it meant was transferring decisions from the government, which has at least some responsibility to the population, transfer it to unaccountable private power, which has no commitment except for self-enrichment. That was made explicit. The guru of neoliberalism, economics guru, Milton Friedman, pronounced in an important article that corporations have no goal except self-enrichment. Anything else is a violation of the holy market principles. He didn't bother to say that the right of incorporation is a gift given by the government with many advantages, but it confers no responsibilities. Under neoliberal doctrine, just to offer to enrich yourself at everyone else's expense. Well, what do you get when you have transferring decisions to private power, which has no responsibilities except self-enrichment? Actually, we have some pretty good measures of that now for the United States. Recently, the Rand Corporation, super respectable government-affiliated corporation, tried to do a study of the transfer of wealth in the past 40 years from the lower 90% of the population, working class, middle class, to the top. Their estimate's about $50 trillion, which is a serious underestimate, because when Reagan took off and we became market happy, he opened the spigots, telling business, do whatever you like. Lots of things that were illegal suddenly became legal, like tax havens, shell companies. Rough estimates, it's mostly secret, but rough estimates are probably another 30, 40 trillion dollars a year. So that's roughly $80 trillion of robbery in 40 years. I mean, well, real wages have actually declined, benefits have declined, people pretty much left out to hang. Reagan and Thatcher, or whoever did their thinking for them, understood that you have to eliminate any form of self-defense. Major defense is unions, always has been. So their first acts were attack the unions, destroy them. And it shows. I don't know if you can have a chart from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I don't know if you can see it if I show it, but I don't know if that's visible, but it is. Well, so it's strike actions over the years. Begins over here. This is the 50s. It keeps pretty steady until this point. Right here is the late 70s, and comes Reagan, goes way down, stays flat, now the lowest it's ever been. That's destruction of labor. Very effective destruction of labor. By now, labor is so weak that there are literally no strikes. Here's Bureau of Labor statistics. If you take into account growth of employment, work stoppages last year, which include lockdowns, incidentally, are about 2 by 1950 standards, as compared with 400 by 1950. That's what we've gotten thanks to neoliberalism. Point is, eliminate any form of self-defense. As Thatcher famously put it, there's no society, just individuals somehow supposed to find their way in the market if they're lucky. If not, tough luck. That's how the world works. Britain's seen enough of it. Well, I'll just end by saying we're in a situation not very different from the 1920s. Gilded Age, exuberance, huge inequality. We've just barely gotten back to it. Destroyed the Union, and the United States had totally destroyed the unions. They were gone. There were two choices to be made in the early 30s. One was to fascism, one was to social democracy. We shouldn't be taken in by contemporary propaganda about fascism. Now it's the height of all evils. That's since the Second World War. It was not true in the 30s. It was viewed rather favorably by British and American elites. Didn't love it, but pretty favorable to it. It was holding off the worst danger of left-wing activism, what was called Bolshevism. So those were the choices in the 30s, went in two different directions. The United States, the New Deal went in a social democratic direction. It was not by a religious conversion. It was by militant action of a rising labor movement. Very effective. Got to the point, I remember this from childhood, got to the point of sit-down strikes. That's a threat. A sit-down strike tells management, we are one step short of taking this enterprise over and kicking you out because we don't need you. We can run it better ourselves. At that point, things changed. The Supreme Court, reactionary, of course, had been blocking every New Deal measure. At that point, started accepting them. At that point, business didn't like it, but they sort of tolerated it. There was no choice because the alternative was real radical moves. Well, that's pretty much where we are now. Things have changed, of course. There's been a lot of progress in the last century, but they're very threatening resonances. This choice, then fascism or social democracy, echoed Rosa Luxemburg's pronouncement in 1915, midst of the First World War, writing from jail, where all opponents of the war were. She said the choice is socialism or barbarism. That was the choice in the early 30s. It was a close call. We're in a somewhat similar situation now, and the fate of humanity depends on it, because if we don't move soon to a form of radical democracy, which will let people's power force the actions that have to be taken, we can say the end to the human experiment on Earth.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was some really, really interesting insights. I guess I'll build on what you said on some of these neoliberal, like the kind of manipulation of neoliberalism, where key policies such as the tax cuts for the wealthy, the deregulation, the defunding of social welfare programs, this involves convincing a large proportion of the population to vote against their own economic interests. And now with the climate crisis, even against their own safety. You have spoken about the importance of an informed, engaged public to overcome this, helping the public to vote in their own interests rather than that of a wealthy elite. However, like you say, this is the responsibility of the intellectuals and experts to inform or expose the truth. But how can experts and intellectuals do this in this kind of anti-expert, post-truth world of Trumpism? And I would add to that where lies and misinformation are propagated really efficiently and effectively by media outlets such as Fox News. How can that be countered?
The way we always have. There are no magic keys. It's been much worse before. You just have to struggle. I mean, yes, they're strong, they're powerful, they have plenty of money, they're going to fight, but you can overcome them. It's been done in other ways. It actually was done in the 30s. The media were very conservative, very right-wing, pretty much pro-fascist, were strongly anti-New Deal, pro-business. There was a rising labor movement, and that was crucial. But there were also popular movements, popular parties. A lot of these have been destroyed in post-war repression, especially in the United States, but elsewhere too. They can be reconstituted just as they were in the 30s, just as in other times, many other cases. Take any example you like. Take, say, what's really in the United States, an extraordinary issue, same to a lesser but significant extent in Britain and on the continent, white supremacy. In the United States, it's deeply rooted. I go back to the civil rights movement. In the 1950s, there were still lynchings. You may have seen the photographs when Eisenhower, the Supreme Court, liberal Supreme Court, did force schools to open to blacks, force by law. Eisenhower called federal troops to let a little black girl go to school. And you may recall the photographs, if you haven't, you should look them up, of federal troops escorting maybe a 10-year-old girl past jeering, shouting mobs who wanted to kill her because she was trying to go to school. Okay, that was mid-50s. 1955, Emmett Till, who's one case which is famous just because his mother kept fighting about it. There were many others. He was a black kid from the North, went to the South, looked at a white woman in a store in a way which somebody didn't like, and dragged out and tortured, murdered, buried. End of it. Many such cases. This one didn't end only because his mother refused to give up. Other civil rights activists supported her. Finally, the story broke through, didn't save him. But the civil rights movement finally developed after a long struggle. But remember what it was like. 1963, Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. His unpopularity rating was about 50%. King then went on. He didn't end there. Our story about it, our narrative ends there. His life didn't end. He went on to organize in the North, to organize a poor people's movement, integrated movement of poor people. His popularity sank to less than a quarter. He was more unpopular than Trump, okay? Because this is 1968, years of work. Well, been a lot of work since. Finally get to the Black Lives Matter movement. After the George Floyd murder, the biggest social movement in American history developed quickly, integrated, black and white together, supportive about 2/3 of the population, way more than Martin Luther King had at the peak of his popularity, way beyond what he had when he tried to move to the North and was smashed. Okay, that's progress. Going back to your question, the forces against it were far more serious than those that we face. You're not going to get lynched. You're not going to get murdered for trying to get a black voter to have the courage to vote. These were real barriers. Same with the anti-war movement. Okay, we've got a legacy. We enjoy a legacy granted to us by those who didn't give up under much harder circumstances. We have no right to say it's too hard today. We're much better off. So you struggle.
Thank you. Those are some really inspiring words. I guess I'll follow from that with the fact that neoliberalism has drastically decreased the political feasibility of significant government intervention in the name of freedom, liberty, and pro-market policies. However, COVID has shown that governments are able to take drastic measures during a crisis. For example, with the total lockdowns, curfews, etc., with relatively little backlash, even in the most liberal democracies. This acceptance seems due to the impacts of the COVID crisis being immediate and tangible, whereas the impacts of the climate crisis appear more intangible and far off to most, especially in the West. How can this feeling of urgency in the climate crisis be communicated to the public, so to enable necessary government intervention on climate action? And is there anything actually from your research on language that you feel would improve the way that climate change and its impacts are communicated to the public?
Actually, it's all pretty simple. You don't need complex theory to explain it. It's all on the surface. Intellectuals can try to make it look complicated with polysyllables, but talk about theories and so on, but we can put that aside. It's very straightforward. It's exactly what Pierre Humbert said. It's time to panic now. We don't have time. The facts are clear. We'll present them to people. We understand the barriers. We can see you have to dismantle the neoliberal fraud. It's mostly fraud. It's not a pro-market system. That's ludicrous. Take the neoliberal globalization, the peak of neoliberalism globally, World Trade Organization, NAFTA, the others. Nothing free market about them. They're called free trade agreements. They're not free market, and they're not trade agreements. very little of them has to do with trade. Trims, for example, special rights for investors, nothing to do with trade. In fact, tariffs were very low. This barely changes them. What it is protectionism. The core system of the neoliberal free trade agreements is protection for investors. They're investor rights agreements. Core part, huge part, right on again on the front pages now, the struggle with China. China's not adhering to the TRIPS conditions, intellectual property conditions. Shocking. China's doing what England did when it deindustrialized and robbed India and stole its higher technology to become a rich country. China's doing what the United States did when it ripped off higher British technology with high protectionist measures, just like England had, until its growth to become a great country, great economy. Same with every other country. So China's doing it. We can't tolerate that. In fact, there's a name for it in economic history. It's called kicking away the ladder. First you climb it, then you kick it away so nobody else can. So England pioneered high protectionism, technology, robbery of technology, India, China, even Ireland, the Low Countries. England didn't move towards formal free market policies till mid-19th century, 1846. By then it had over twice the per capita capitalization of any other country. So markets are fine if we're going to win, okay? As soon as England started facing Japanese competition, which British manufacturers couldn't face, close the door. England closed off the empire to Japan. It's one of the major factors behind the Second World War in the Pacific. For Japan was cut off from its resources and investment base, mostly by Britain, followed by the Dutch, followed by the Americans. Protectionism for yourself, subsidy for yourself, markets for the other guys. So India under Britain could have markets, so it could deindustrialize and become India, okay? It's all fraud, total fraud from beginning to the end. You can dismantle it. You don't need any deep understanding. It's very transparent. It's right on the surface. You have to bring it to people. Actually, that's what the labor movement was about. The labor movement wasn't just working workplace. It was a culture. There were worker education programs, cultural programs, concerts, science programs. Workers became educated. You look back at British workers in the 19th century. There's major studies of this. They were uneducated. And they were better educated than aristocrats, literally, reading classics. You read the labor press in the 19th century. It's amazing. I've done it very lively in the United States, but I've looked at them probably the same in England. I mean, they were highly sophisticated work by formerly uneducated working people, many of them women, what were called factory girls brought in from the farms, work in the mills, highly sophisticated work. I can even remember that from childhood when there was a live labor movement with strong educational and cultural programs. My own family was first generation immigrant, mostly unemployed workers, little formal education. Some of the most educated people I've ever run into after 70 years in the elite universities. Okay, that's part of the labor movement. That can all be reconstituted. These are the ways you can reach people. All of this is possible. It was picked up from even a lower point in the early 1930s. Labor had been really destroyed, much worse than now. And the culture was much worse than it is now, much more violent and brutal. So, okay, let's pick it up and do it again. It's been done before.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting. I guess this will be my final question before we move on to audience questions. So given the relatively short timescales we need to reach net zero emissions, which is under 30 years, you have said dismantling capitalism is impossible in the timeframe necessary for us to take urgent action, where we need to take urgent action. And you've said that we need to modify or work within the framework of our existing institutions, but modifying them as necessary. So what modifications and changes are needed to our domestic and international institutions? And I would also say that they seem, some of the things I spoke about in the introduction they seem very short-termist, particularly governments in democracies where they're focused on quick wins for short-term election cycles, not whereas climate action needs early action. So how can we also address short-termism in our democracies and societies as well?
Well, the first thing we can do, which is hardly utopian, is to go back to something like the regimented capitalism of the pre-neoliberal years. I mean, these, in fact, were the best years for state capitalism, highest growth rates, trente glorieuses, as they're called in Europe, golden age, they called by American economists. Can at least go back to that. Those were years in which there was very high growth by historical standards, egalitarian growth, same for the lower quintile and the higher quintile. Minimum wage tracked productivity. It collapsed after that. We can at least go back to that and then move on. We can do much better than that. There's no reason why decisions should be made by banks in New York and Chicago and London and Frankfurt. They should be made by people. The European Union had deep flaws. One of them is that decisions were transferred to the unelected bureaucracy in Brussels, with the German banks looking over their shoulders. So we had ridiculous austerity programs, good for the banks, rotten for everyone else. England had its own version under New Labour and the Tories. None of that needed. Trillions of dollars lost, lives lost. All that can be dismantled. We can get rid of the huge destructive effects of financial institutions just simply by things like serious financial transaction tax, which will eliminate a large amount of the pointless, harmful, predatory trading, mostly automated these days. Cut it down to size, turn them back into banks, break them up if necessary. We shouldn't have Google and Facebook deciding that a moderately left YouTube channel can't accept ads in order to try to kill it. That shouldn't be made by a decision in some Silicon Valley office. All of that stuff has to be dismantled. That can be done in a short time span with significant action, and you can certainly go beyond. For example, by moving towards an age where there will not be people subjected to masters. We should remember that until the 20th century, the idea that a person should be subjected to a master, meaning what we call take a job, was regarded as a fundamental assault on human dignity and human rights, something which no one should be subjected to. It was such a popular belief that it was even a slogan of the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln, that wage labor is intolerable except unless it's temporary and a person can be a free person again. Well, we're not in the 19th century. Now we have big enterprises and so on. But why should, let's take something concrete. Suppose you have a steel factory in a town in Indiana, and the bankers in Chicago and New York think they can make more profit if they move it to a non-union, low-cost area in northern Mexico. Why should they have the right to make that decision? Why not the people in the workforce and the community? Well, that's the way it should be. take over the enterprises, set up worker-owned enterprises. In fact, it's happening on not a huge, but a notable scale. Can move on from there. There are steps towards it, like co-determination, which actually exists in Germany. Workers on boards of directors can move on from there. All of these things can be done in parallel. And it also means developing a culture of understanding that you have democratic rights. That's been beaten out of people's heads. They don't even think they have democratic rights. Decisions are made by some big guy somewhere. And you look at polls, 80% of the population in the neoliberal year says the government is run by big interests looking out for themselves. They don't know who they are. Sometimes the demagogues will tell them it's elites, whatever that is. We know who they are. They're sitting right in the corporate boardrooms. They're the ones whose wealth has doubled from 0.1% of the population has doubled its wealth to 20% of wealth during the neoliberal years. That's where they are. They're making decisions. They're funding the elections. They're running the political parties. That's why the political parties are just not answerable to the people. Actually, I don't know about England, but in the United States, it's been intensively studied, carefully studied. And roughly, maybe 90% of the population, the lower 90% on the income level, are effectively unrepresented, and that their own representatives don't vote according to their attitudes. They listen to other voices. Those are going to pay their campaign funding for the next election. And there's a variant of that almost everywhere. That's why the mainstream parties have collapsed almost everywhere. In Europe, the traditional center-left, center-right parties that have run the place forever gone. Some of them barely exist. Venerable parties like Social Democrats in Germany, go back to the 19th century. Can't even find them. In the United States, the parties keep their names. It's a very regressive political system. So you keep the names, but they've changed. Both parties are falling apart. It's very interesting to watch. The Republicans are split right now in an interesting way, which will have a lot of consequences to the future. They're owned by the rich and the powerful. They're basically the corporate business party. And the business world was willing to tolerate Trump's antics. They didn't like them as long as he was lining their pockets. And he did. All of his, for all the populist garbage, every legislative program enriched the rich and empowered the corporate sector, without exception. So they were willing to tolerate it. January 6th, they said straight out, unanimously, this is too much, get lost. There were marching orders. It's very interesting to see what happened. The most influential Republican senator, Mitch McConnell, started running for the exits. Other senators ran with him. The big guys that talked, we followed. But they didn't get too far, because when they got to the exits, they had this raging crowd that Trump had mobilized, not just at the Capitol, all over the country. He's a very effective demagogue. He's the Republican Party, the voting base is in his pocket. And they're caught between a voting base that they're afraid of and the big guys with the money and who they're even more afraid of. And you can see them vacillating. Something similar is happening with the Democrats. Democratic National Committee is Clintonite, neoliberal, Wall Street oriented. They want to maintain the harsh neoliberal programs. The voting base is much more progressive. I mean, they're called socialist. What it means is mildly social democratic. You look at Sanders's programs in Europe, you wouldn't even notice them. It's calling for universal health care. Wow, who could imagine that? Too radical for Americans. But mild social democratic programs, that's the voting base. National Committee wants to stop it. The struggle going on. And in fact, the struggle's going on worldwide. How are we going to escape? What, after the pandemic is over, will be over, how will we create a post-pandemic world? Is it going to be an extension of the neoliberal disaster, even harsher, with more surveillance, more control? Or is it going to be a new world that'll create a better world for people, face the climate crisis and overcome it, face other crises, deal with it, create a much better world, not just social democratic, but moving on beyond that? Those are both possibilities. And right now there's kind of an international class war going on over which way it'll go. And it's going to determine, literally this time, it'll determine the fate of the species. The stakes are much higher than they've ever been.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. That was some really fascinating insights. So moving on to the audience questions, I might group a few together. A couple of people have asked on the theme of civil disobedience and some of the things you've spoken about. So Marco has asked, what can trade unions do to stop climate change? And someone else has also asked, is Extinction Rebellion a good way forward, or are they too extreme? So on that theme, what are your thoughts?
Let's take a look at the trade unions and climate change. I'll keep to the United States, which I know better. The first major environmentalist movement was the Oil, Chemical, Atomic Workers Union. They're on the front line. They're suffering from it. They had a great leader, Tony Mazzocchi, one of the first environmentalists in the United States, pretty radical guy, ran the union, late 60s, early 70s, before the environmental movement had taken off. They were pushing for it very hard. They're the ones who forced through the Nixon administration the last liberal programs, Office of Safety and Health, and in plants, anti-pollution moves, and so on. That was the first environmental movement, right out of the unions and the guys who were right at the heart of it. Oil, Chemical, Atomic Workers Union. Tony Mazzocchi went on from that, tried to develop a labor party, which would be based on the unions. Well, that was smashed by the neoliberal assault, but it can be picked up, and it is being picked up. My co-author, Bob Pollan, economist, who co-author of the book we just wrote on global warming, he's working directly with unions on the problem of how to deal with two things: how to deal with climate change and what the destruction it's causing to their own communities and to the world, and also how to handle their problem, say the problem of oil workers as the fossil fuel production system gets closed down. Has to be closed down. Either it's closed down or we're toast, okay? So it'll be closed down. Does that mean they're left to hang out and dry? Not necessarily. They can get better jobs in renewable energy. They'll need subsidy and support. Doesn't amount to much. It's a rounding error in GDP if you look at the numbers, which is he's ground out. But it has to be done. You don't give it to them, you get what you just saw in the last election in the United States. So a lot of talk about what happened in Texas, South Texas. South Texas, a Mexican-American area, oil-based economy, hadn't voted Republican in 100 years. They voted for Trump. Why? Because the message that they were getting is that Biden wants to destroy our economy, our communities, our jobs, all because some pointy-headed liberal somewhere claimed that there's global warming going on. Trump's going to stand up for us and make sure there's more oil poured away. Okay, if that's the message you get from Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, Wall Street Journal, how are you going to vote? Well, if the Democratic Party were an actual political party, not Wall Street professional based, they'd be down there organizing people, telling them, look, fossil fuels are going to end, period. If they don't end, it's all over. game's over. So for your own benefit, you're going to move to eliminating fossil fuels. Here's how you can do it. Here's a very concrete program that you can do it, get better lives for yourselves, better jobs, better work for your community, work in renewable energy, work in other professions, construction. Infrastructure is needed. We need an electric grid. We need even things like refitting houses and buildings. Tons of work, kind of work you guys can do better than anyone else. That's what they should be telling them. Well, that's beginning with the unions. It should be. They're the ones who should be spearheading it, as they've done in the past. You look over the past, whenever there's been a major reform, almost every time, it's been a combination of activist unions and a moderately synthetic administration. That combination seems almost essential.
Thank you. Someone's asked, many recent economic reports suggest that averting the climate crisis is intrinsically tied to future economic growth and stability. Why has this failed to capture the capitalist imagination?
Because you can make money this way. I mean, take that editorial I quoted from the Wall Street Journal. The editors know as well as we do that we're going to fall, that we're racing towards an abyss. But the mentality is, doesn't matter. So our grandchildren will all die. Who cares? We have to make money tomorrow. In fact, if I don't make money tomorrow, somebody else will push me out. I'll take the electric grid in Texas, okay? Move to the market, wonderful. That means competing, instead of a statewide program for an electric grid, part of a national program, which of course it has to be in order to function sanely. It's individual corporations saying, I want a piece of it. All right, suppose you run one of those corporations. You want a piece of it, and you have a choice. Should I try to add some stability to the part of the system that I run at cost to me to overcome vulnerability, while the other guy doesn't do it and buys me out? That's capitalism. It's a suicide pact, okay? It's built into the system that it's suicidal. Actually, business always understood that. That's why if you look over the past centuries, business has often called for regulation. It's been business quite often that called for regulation, railroads, other things, because they know, they understand that capitalism is a suicide pact. If you don't get controlled, you're going to be destroyed. Well, we don't have to let it stay in those hands and keep it in popular hands, handle what's right. But if you just think through the logic of it, it's obvious suicide pact.
Thank you for that. I guess one of the final audience questions, someone said, in the Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh, he describes our inability to respond to climate change as a crisis of imagination, arguing that fiction fails to provide a blueprint for what is to come. As a linguist, what do you think is the role of language in providing a conceptual apparatus to conceptualize the climate crisis?
I'll drop the phrase as a linguist because that doesn't add anything. As a person with moderate common sense, I know what you know and what we all know. These are not deep problems. These are not problems of quantum theory. The matter is on the surface. You have to know some things. Any moderately literate person could know them. If we had the education programs in labor unions that they had in the 1930s, every working person would know them. When I talk to working class groups, as I do whenever I can, I mean, they're imbued with the Fox story, but it doesn't take much to say, look, here's what's going on. Take a look at the facts. Here's the ways out. It's not hard. So we have to use, I mean, you mentioned literature and the arts. music, that can do it too. It's always been a part of organizing and activism. Uh, as far back as you go, whether it's murals, music, revolutionary music, revolutionary literature, poetry, it's always been there. It's the ways in which people get inspired and act. It has to be backed by understanding. It's all of a piece, okay? And then you can move forward. As I said before, it's been done under much harsher conditions than we face. I'll say it again, we're certainly not facing firing squads, the gulag, nothing like that. People do work under those conditions all over the world, in fact. I've seen many of them, third world countries. Conditions we can't imagine, but they keep at it. And we don't even have the conditions that we had 60, 70 years ago. Nothing like that, okay? It was bad enough then, not now. A lot of victories have been won. You can see it internationally. The United States, 60, 70 years ago, didn't like a country, the country's government, you invade it, you overthrow the government, you stick in a dictatorship. It was routine. Can't do that since the 60s. One of the achievements of the 60s was to develop a permanent anti-war movement. Elites didn't like it. So elite intellectuals, like my favorite one is Norman Podhoretz, who you may know, well-known conservative intellectual. He raged against what he called the sickly inhibition against using military force, which came about from the 60s activism. There's now a sickly inhibition against using military force. That's true. So you can't invade. What you have to do is impose sanctions, which are brutal and destructive, but less so than sending in the Marines or imposing a brutal dictatorship. Okay, that's progress. Not the utopia, but progress. And it means conditions are easier for us, for those of us who want to do something. We can't appeal to the fact it looks too hard. It looks much harder elsewhere. It's looked much harder in the past. We're lucky. We're living off that legacy of achievement. We can go on.
Thank you, Professor. I think just before we finish, then I'll say a final question is, there's a lot of students and people watching here who care about the climate and are not sure what to do next, maybe feel powerless. Is there any final words or any advice that you would like to leave these people with, students with?
We are absolutely not powerless. We have plenty of power. We can go back to my favorite philosopher, not far from you, David Hume, a couple of miles to the north. Take a look at his First Principles of Government, one of the first major modern works of political science. He opens it in the first paragraph by saying he's astonished by the easiness with which the general population subordinates themselves to power. He says, they have the power. How come they just hand it over to the powerful? He says, when we look into how this miracle is accomplished, it's accomplished by consent, by ideology, what Gramsci discussed many years later. People just succumb to the propaganda of the powerful, which says you're powerless. You have to subordinate yourself to us. You don't have. He was saying, no, he wasn't a revolutionary by any means, but he was saying, this miracle doesn't have to persist. That's the message we can get from it. And over the years, people have recognized that. Say, no, I don't have to succumb to the ideological control of the powerful. They say we're powerless. David Hume says we have the power, and he's right. We take it, we have it. They're powerless. Go back to the sit-down strikes in the 30s. Business understood that they were at the verge of losing everything because the only power they have is the willingness of workers to subordinate themselves to their will. The workers who were sitting in the factories could have taken them over, They know how to run them, not the guy sitting in offices somewhere. It was close to that. It's always close to that. It's close to it in many respects. It's close to it on climate. We can shut down the fossil fuel industries, but we have to work at it. We have to not, I mean, the biggest barrier is the propaganda that says, I'm powerless. You're not. Any choices are all over. I mean, take the United States, group of young kids, Sunrise Movement activists, young activists, were working, finally got to the point of occupying congressional offices and demanding that they put a Green New Deal on the legislative agenda. That's a prerequisite for survival. It's not a debatable issue. You can debate the terms, but the idea has to be there. It had been ridiculed before that. They got a little support from some of the young women who had come in the Sanders wave, mainly Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She came in and supported them. They got support from an older Massachusetts Senator, Ed Markey, who'd been climate activist for years. Enough of that came along, moved from ridicule to on the legislative agenda. How many? That's one thing you can do. You can take part in Extinction Rebellion and their actions. Lots of things. You can force the people in office to do what they have to do or else get rid of them. And the same with the ones in the corporate boardrooms. They're not there by an act of God or by merit or anything like that. They have power because they claim they have power. Doesn't necessarily belong to them. So there's all sorts of things you can do.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. Those were some really inspiring words to finish on.